done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever into ages of ages.
Amen. All right, hello to everyone. Today I'm going to be using a new tool, which is this, given to me by Terry. So hopefully this will help me point things out on the screen. What? I've brought a stick, yes. Yes, I'm very, modern now, I guess. Anyway, so this is the third of 4 lectures on the hymnography of the church and the saints who wrote it. First lecture was on the Divine Liturgy and those saints associated with it. Second lecture, which was last week, we looked at Ephraim and Romanus, a couple of the 2 early hymnographers of the church, and some of the ones who started really producing a large variety or a great deal of work about saints, about feasts, basically hymns as teaching tools. And today I want to move a little bit further forward in history and talk about a few other saints who really were active during some of basically the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries of Byzantium, who also produced a great deal of festal music and kind of codified the way we choose which hymns to sing in church. Now, all of these people could be a lecture on their own, as well as some of the topics I'm going to discuss, but I'm going to do my best to give an overview here. So, today we will be discussing John of Damascus here, Kosmas, his brother, Theodore the Studite up here, and Cassia. All right, so just a brief overview of what was happening in Eastern Christendom during their lifetimes. Basically, if we look at 675, that's about the time that John of Damascus was born. 865 was the year that Cassia died, so this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of a time period. You had one major threat from outside, which was the expansion of Islam. To give you an idea, chronologically, the Prophet Muhammad died in 632. Basically, he was in Saudi Arabia, and this map here represents the Mediterranean world in 750, so about 120 years after his death. All of these parts here in green, this is basically the expansion of the Islamic world at that time. So you can see basically your entire Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, North Africa, up into Spain, even to kind of the bottom of what we would now call France, into Persia, which is modern Iran, and here, all of Syria and the Holy Land. This did not mean that Christianity was necessarily illegal or categorically banned. As you'll find out, there were still Christians quite active in those areas at that time, but it did mean that the political, bureaucratic, military, basically hierarchy, was under Islamic control at the time. And one of the capitals of the Islamic world was Damascus here. The Umayyad Caliphate basically used Damascus as its center. Now, the other issue that was going on was the iconoclast controversy, which occurred basically from 726 to 843. Now, that was not continuous. Depending on who was emperor at the time, things kind of swung back and forth as to whether the iconoclast position, basically which said no icons, icons are idolatry, and the iconodule or iconophile, which said icons are very necessary and proper, was which one of those was basically ascendant. But the iconoclast controversy basically kicks off in 726 with an emperor called Leo the Isaurian, and it doesn't really end until 843. Now, during that time, even in spite of, or perhaps because of these challenges, you see this great flowering of Christian monasticism and of hymnography in the Byzantine world. The challenges seem to bring forth a great deal of fruit. So, our first saint here, John of Damascus. His dates, he lived from roughly 675 to 749, and he was born in Damascus and served at the Muslim court there. Again, Damascus was one of the major political centers of the Islamic world. We know who his grandfather was, we know who his father was. They were also both extremely highly placed. John was a Christian, and he basically left the Muslim court and he entered into monasticism at a place called Mar Saba, effectively Saint Sabas. Now that was named after the original Saint Saba, not the Serbian Saint Saba, but the original Saint Saba, who is a monastic in what is now the Kidron Valley, which is a little bit east of Jerusalem. So he entered monasticism there, and then wrote a great deal from that location. He was one of the first people to really challenge Islam from a theological perspective. Obviously, a number of people were worried about Islam just for military reasons or things like that, or because they recognized this as a different religion, they didn't want to necessarily convert. But John of Damascus really got into the arguments of Islam, and he read the Quran, and he took parts of the Quran and said, this is where it contradicts what we teach as Christians. When iconoclasm started, he was also a very staunch defender of the icons. That, of course, got him in trouble with some folks both in Byzantium who were iconoclasts and at the Islamic court as well. And he, at one point, had his hand cut off. And I will talk a little bit about that incident in the next slide. But he was an extremely prolific author. He wrote a great deal of theological treatises. One is a very staunch defense of the icons. He wrote a really beautiful one on the Trisagion hymn, why we say holy, holy, holy. And then he wrote a great deal of hymnography, which we'll discuss a little bit later here. So, my Serbian interlude. I mentioned that John of Damascus had his hand cut off. Apparently he was falsely accused of basically betraying somebody at the Muslim court. He had his hand cut off, and he prayed before an icon of the Theotokos, and she restored his hand. So, in thanksgiving, he had a silver hand made and then attached to the icon. So this one's now called the icon of the three hands. We see these are of course, the original two hands in the icon, and then the extra one, the third one down there. Now, so John of Damascus took this icon with him when he went to Mar Saba, and then a few centuries later, another Saint Sabas showed up at Mar Saba, and he was basically given this icon, and he took it to Hollander Monastery, where it still resides on Athos. I was looking into this. I understand it actually went to Serbia for a little while. I believe that Tsar Dušan took it from Athos back to Serbia, but then it eventually came back to Hollander, and it's still there. All right. Our second saint I want to talk about was John's brother, whose name was Kosmas, or Kosma, of Maiune. And I should say here that none of these names were originally written in English or even in the Latin alphabet. So if you do a search for any of these folks, you might see it spelled with a C, you might see it spelled with a K, you might see an S on the end. Just sometimes you have to get a little bit creative. But if you look up Saint Cosma, Orthodox poet, you'll probably get to the right place. course, but apparently died at a relatively old age here. I've seen a date that actually is an even longer date range, which suggests he was over 100 when he died. So he was raised with John at Damascus. They had the same tutor, they were in the same household, and then they both went to the same monastery together. In 743, he was ordained a bishop at the harbor of Gaza, basically to give you an idea of where that Maiune was. But he was a great collaborator with his brother John on a lot of their poetry, especially the canons that they wrote. And he worked with John to kind of codify the octoikos, which I'll get into. It's one of the ways we organize our hymns, how we decide what we're going to sing when. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what they wrote in terms of hymnography. This is the brothers kind of composing together, which is quite nice. I like this icon here. So what they really worked on was what's called the Matins canon. Last week I talked about something called the Kontakion, which is a very long kind of poem on a theological subject. It could be something from the Bible, it could be the life of a saint, a feast, what have you. And it's these series of repeated stanzas with the same line at the end of them. This was a very impressive form of poetry. It was also a very complicated form of poetry. And people in the earlier centuries loved to write these, but they got to a point where they realized there's not a lot of people who can actually sing them, especially sing them well. So what they did instead was what we call the canon, which is, it's a long poem still. It's basically got 9 odes, and then there's little supplemental verses between them. And in practice, we actually usually only do 8 odes. We pull the second one out because the second one is considered very penitential. But there is one canon, very important canon, in which we do the entire thing. That's the great canon of St. Andrew. I'll get to that later. So what John and Kosmas did was they wrote a lot of these canons, especially on feasts. If you pull out the hymnography for our feast, turn to any great feast of the church, odds are extremely high that it will be either John or Kosmas or both who wrote the canon for that feast. And sometimes it is both of them. Because if you do a full canon, you'll start by singing Ode 1 for Canon 1, do your verses, and then conclude with basically Ode 1 for Canon 2. You can get kind of overlapping ones. The other interesting thing about the canon is they knew it was replacing the Kontakion. They still liked Kontakia, even if they were complicated. So you'll see that right in the middle of the canon, after Ode 6, you still have one little piece of the Kontakion left.
So that's just a remnant.
It's a remnant. Yeah, it's a remnant, basically, and then the rest of the canon's built around it. And I read a couple of the ones we still have last week, like, for example, Palm Sunday, which was written by Kosmas, still has a Kontakion from Romanus, one verse of the Kontakion from Romanus in the middle of it. And then,
Can you just explain what you mean by
adopted brother? He wasn't a book. Yes, exactly. So the question here was, what was meant by Kosmas being the adopted brother of John, and it was literally that. He wasn't a brother by blood, but John's father adopted this other child and then raised them together. Yep. All right. The other thing that Kosmas and John really did was they codified what's called the octoikos. Octo, of course, means 8. Octoikos basically means the cycle of 8 tones. And this is a detail from a larger icon called the Synaxis of the Hymnographers. We see Romanus in the middle here. And then here we have John and we have Kosmas, right? And between them, they're holding a copy of the Octoikos. When we choose which hymns to sing on any given day, we don't just do that at random. Basically, we have several cycles going on throughout the year. One is there a feast or a saint for this particular date on the calendar? That's one thing. Another one is, are we in the Lenten season? If so, what Sunday are we at? That's another one called the Triodian. The time after Pascha, we have something similar. You know, how many Sundays are we away from Pascha? But there's there is also something that we call the octoikos, which is the cycle of 8 tones. This starts on Thomas Sunday with tone 1, and then the next Sunday will be tone 2, then tone 3, tone 4, tone 5, tone 6, tone 7, tone 8, then you cycle back to tone 1. This means on any given day, basically, you count back how far has it been from Thomas Sunday. You can open up your cycle of 8 tones, your book, and you can see, hey, it's Wednesday, we're in tone 7, and there's your verses to sing for that day. Then you, it makes it much easier to know, you're just not making it up on the fly. Basically, this starts Thomas Sunday, it cycles all the way through the year until we get to Palm Sunday. All the music for Holy Week and for the Bright Week, the week after Pascha, are kind of outside of time. They don't really correspond to this. So, these two brothers did a great deal of work, a lot of composition of canons, a lot of work, you know, kind of codifying these 8 tones, and basically some people in Byzantium, in the Constantinople area, picked up on this and tried to move forward with it. So the next guy I'm going to talk about is named Theodore the Studite here. Very important saint in the history of our church. His dates are a little later, 759 to 826. He was born and lived in the general Constantinople area. He entered monasticism at about the age of 20, apparently with his entire family. Just his whole family, mom, dad, brothers, sisters, everybody went into monasteries at the same time. By 798, he had become the abbot of what was called the Studios, or sometimes Studion monastery, which was near Constantinople. He did not create this monastery, but it had kind of fallen into neglect. And the empress sent him there to basically revive it, which he definitely did. He wrote what was called a typica, or a typicon, which is kind of a rule of life and a rule of worship for a monastery. It proved to be extremely popular, and then all of the daughter monasteries started using it, and it kind of spread throughout the Eastern world. He also was a great supporter of poetry, of composition, and of books and literature in general. One of the things he did to expand this monastery was he expanded the library, and he did what was called a scriptorium, which is a building that's specifically there for people to copy manuscripts, basically the way to make copies. Extremely labor intensive, but it was the only way to do it at the time. He took these, this work on the octoikos that Cosma and John had done. He kind of brought it over to Byzantium. He added some more verses, or had more verses added if he felt there were any gaps there. And then, of course, that expanded out from the, this monastery of his as well. And then he was a great supporter of icons, and that actually got him into trouble with some of the emperors of Byzantium at the time, because again, it was going back and forth, back and forth. He actually ended up dying in exile. He had been invited. Basically what had happened, there had been an emperor who was really, really against icons. That emperor sent Theodore away from his monastery. Next emperor comes in, and Theodore says, well, what do you think about the icons? And this guy tried to take kind of a compromise and said, look, I'm not going to ban icons. If you want to use them in your monastery, that's fine. You can come back to your monastery. Won't be any problems. Just we don't want to see any icons within the city limits of Constantinople. And Theodore did not like that response. He said, no, we have to have icons in worship. And so he stayed outside of Constantinople and eventually did repose there in 826. Now, Theodore was also a supporter of many hymnographers, and one of the people he supported was Cassia here. Again, if you want to search for her, you can search for Cassia with a C, with a K, There's also, sometimes they put an N on the end of her name, call her Cassia. She lived from 810 to 865. She was very upper class Byzantine noblewoman. And at the time, something they did was when you had basically the heir apparent, the prince, it came time for him to choose his official bride. They would do what was called a bride show, which is they would take all of the eligible ladies from the right class of society and bring them out to him, and he was given the golden apple, and he had to give the golden apple to the one he wanted. Interesting thing, that seems like it's something that goes back to these stories about the Trojan War, where Paris had to give the golden apple, and that didn't end so well, so I'm not sure why they decided to keep doing that, but besides that. So he was there with his golden apple, all the ladies are there, and Cassia is there, and he kind of comes to Cassia, and he thinks she's really beautiful, but maybe too beautiful. And then he's kind of talking to one of his attendants and says, I don't know, she might just be too beautiful. After all, you know, all of the worst things in the world came to the world through a woman. And Cassia hears this, and she says, yes, and all the best things in the world came through a woman as well. And he decides, I don't think I'm going to go with this one. And he marries a woman named Theodore instead. So Cassia becomes a nun, becomes a monastic, and eventually an abbess of her convent. She was also a defender of icons against Theophilus, who was that emperor, the one who'd rejected her. She was really closely connected to Theodore the Studite and the Studios monastery, and apparently we still have some letters back and forth between them. And she composed a lot of sacred and secular verses. So I'm not going to sing it, but we still do use several of her hymns. One of the most famous is For Christmas, which starts when Augustus ruled alone upon the earth. We sing that one. But for this time of year, there's one that is literally just called the Hymn of St. Cassia, which I'm going to read. Now, because of when Annunciation falls this year, I'm not sure if we're actually going to hear it, because Annunciation might be bumping this one out of the way. But this one is for Wednesday and Holy Week. The woman who had fallen into many sins, perceiving thy divinity, O Lord, fulfilled the part of a myrrh-bearer, and with lamentations she brought sweet-smelling oil of myrrh to thee before thy burial. Woe is me, she said, for night surrounds me, dark and moonless, and stings my lustful passion with the love of sin. Accept the fountain of my tears, O thou who drawest down from the clouds the waters of the sea. Incline to the groanings of my heart, O thou who in thine ineffable self-emptying hast bowed down the heavens. I shall kiss thy most pure feet and wipe them with the hairs of my head, those feet whose sound Eve heard at dusk in paradise and hid herself for fear. Who can search out the multitude of my sins in the abyss of thy judgments, O Savior of my soul? Despise me not, thine handmaiden, for thou hast mercy without measure. So, before I give it over to Christopher, who will sing a few pieces of music composed by these folks, just want to kind of bring it to a conclusion here. Again, you had challenges from without and from within, and that, I think, inspired many of these saints to really treasure what they had and create things to defend their theology, both from, this new religion and from things that were trying to divide it from within. So really, really inspirational time, just in Byzantium in general. Next week, the topic is going to be St. Andrew of Crete and the hymns that are specific to this time of year, which is called the Triodian. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Christopher, who will be singing a couple of pieces for us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. letters, it's interesting that there are a couple of different interpretations of why Cassia became a nun. One is just that she was rejected by Theophilus, the emperor, and then her only option, was to go into monasticism. Like this had ruined her chances for a marriage. But there was another possibility here, and we kind of see it in some of the letters between Theodore, the Studite, and Cassia, which is by entering monasticism, she then had the opportunity to read and to write and to compose in ways that might not have been as available if she was the head of a household, trying to raise children, oversee servants, all these kinds of things. So sometimes for artistic people or literary people or people who just wanted to pursue a love of learning, especially women, the monastery was the best option. And it's clear that Cassia was extremely well read. Her hymn, When Augustus Ruled Alone Upon the Earth, it shows that she actually read stuff that was written back in the Roman times when Augustus was alive, because there were similar poems written about the Emperor Augustus, talking about, oh, it's so great, we've had civil wars for decades, and now Augustus is here, and Rome is at peace, and these pagan poems praising him, and it's obvious she read those, and then flipped it to be, yes, Augustus ruled this part of the world, but Christ rules everything. Yeah. All right, my darling. Okay, one moment here. Technical things, one sec.
Okay. So I'll do my really grumpy bit and say how much I hate modern technology. Anything beyond steam engines or clocks that work with a pendulum. All right. I had promised a week ago just to restrict this to singing two things. I do still want to restrict it to singing two things, but I think it's worthwhile perhaps to bring up a couple of the points that and I'll do it as briefly as I possibly can, because I know I went on for far too long before. That when we're examining these hymnographers, whether it be from a week ago, who do we have? We had Romanus the Melodist, we had Ephraim the Syrian. This week it's been John of Damascus, Kosmas, Theodore, the nun Cassia. They all belong to a period when there wasn't any sort of musical notation used in church. So we actually have no way of telling how their melodies might have sounded. They were composers, absolutely. They wrote not only the text, they had melodies in mind to go with those texts. But no, the original melodies, we've lost them. Since then, this vast array of different styles of singing within the church have developed. Not just the Serbian church, the Russian church, the Greek church, the Romanian church, the Bulgarian church. Also, as I think I mentioned a week ago, those with whom we're no longer in communion, who actually share some of our hymns, like, for instance, the Copts, the Ethiopians, the Armenians. Okay, so I'm sort of working through the centuries myself. A week ago, I sang you that thing from about year 1100 in Kondakarian chant. Then there was something in Znamienny chant, then there was something in the so-called Bulgarian chant, which all the musicologists say has absolutely nothing to do with Bulgaria. But it's something that arose in southwestern Russia at some point. Want to go back to Znamienny chant first of all, and this week, or this week that's just been and gone, I've been rather more lazy than I was a week or so ago, so I haven't actually prepared anything on the computer. Horrible modern technology stuff. So I'll just be singing out of a book. Proper technology. So the first one I want to do is actually it's the 9th Irmos of the canon for Holy Saturday. It's in an English translation. Somebody has adapted it for English. I'm not quite sure who the editor was here, but it is in Znamienny chant, and we hear it not just at matins on the Friday night of Holy Week. It's also repeated actually on the night of Pascha itself at the midnight office. Let me just go for it, I think. One more thing to add to that is, as we've now, whereas a week ago I was talking about just plain chant, essentially, this is actually what I want to sing from. And even my great talents don't spread to being able to sing 4 parts at the same time, I'm afraid. But the way things developed in Russia when they came to be harmonized is more often than not, the original melody is what appears not as we tend to think of in the West as being the tune in the top part. No, it's actually, there's usually a descant which is follows the melody, which is a third, the interval of a third above. So in this case, the way it's notated, the melody is not the soprano part, it's the alto part. All right, so if you could just hold that for me. Hang on. Do not lament me, O mother, seeing me in the tomb. The Son conceived in the womb without seed, for I shall arise and be glorified with eternal glory. I shall exalt all who magnify thee in faith and in love. So that's the 9th Earmos of the Holy Saturday canon. By contrast, I want to try to sing you this is also a 9th ode, actually, isn't it? It's but this is the Paschal canon. This is the resurrectional canon par excellence, by John of Damascus, I think, is it not? Yes. Okay. And by this stage, we've actually moved on to the chant of the Imperial Court Chapel in St. Petersburg. By that stage, the melodies had been rather simplified, and they relied very much on harmony. So you're going to lose some of it in that I'm just singing one part once more. Let's give it a go. My soul magnifies him who rose from the dead on the 3rd day, Christ the giver of life. Shine, shine on you, Jerusalem, the glory of the Lord has shone on you. Exult now and be glad, O Zion. Be radiant, O pure Theotokos, in the resurrection of thy Son. I promise to keep it short. I think it's a bit shorter than it was a week ago. I'll stop there. Take this device off me.
I got it. All right. There we are. Any last questions? Whoop. It is on. All right. Okay, Nina, and then Nick, I see you as well. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. To repeat for the recording, this one, "Do Not Lament Me, O Mother," is sung a 3rd time on Holy Saturday morning. It replaces the Hymn to the Mother of God, which usually would be something like All of Creation or It Is Truly Meet. But for the big feasts, we actually take Ode 9 of the canon, and that's what we sing in place. So yes, it's sung 3 times during Holy Week, and it's very, very popular. And I will just deviate here for a moment because, interesting, I think pure coincidence, but there is a very powerful symphony by a Polish composer named Górecki called his Symphony Number 3, the Sorrowful Songs Symphony. The second movement of that, the text is taken from something that was found on the wall of a prison cell, written by a young woman who basically had been imprisoned by the Germans. And she had written something out, and it said, "Do not weep for me, mother." Again, I think it's a coincidence, but I always remember that when I hear that Sorrowful Songs Symphony by Goretzky. Nina, you had a question.
So it's just always interesting. We have this monastery,
Mhm.
this Studite monastery.
Right.
What is there on women's monastery attached to that?
Mhm.
My question is, how did Theodore support Cassia?
Yeah. I know there are, so the question here is, how did Theodore support Cassia in her art? And I will say that yes, there were other monasteries, including women's monasteries, that were part of this larger Studite-like complex or network. And Theodore wrote a lot to the various monastics. Even when he was in exile, he kept writing to people. Some of this was theological, some of it was inspirational, but he also talked a lot about how to serve God. And although Theodore didn't write a lot of hymns himself, he did write a lot of poems. And one thing he really did for his monasteries was he would write these little verses, like 4 lines long, talking about how each person in the monastery, regardless of what they did, could serve God and use this as a way to serve God. He had one about people like baking bread, people, serving in the hospital, people, making shoes, whatever. And he wrote these little inspirational verses for them about, if you're making shoes, always think about how Moses had to take his sandals off when he went, up on Mount Sinai. So he very much liked to inspire people and connect people to all the different ways they could serve God. I will try and follow up. I know there are letters. I will try and follow up and see if I can find some of the ones between Theodore and Cassia, because it would be very, very interesting. But they do suggest that she had a real talent, really liked being in the monastery as a way to explore that, and he seemed to encourage her in that effort. So I'll see if I can find one of those and bring it next week. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Well, next week we're going to do Andrew of Crete and the Great Canon, the really big one, as well as just some of the idea of the Lenten Triodian in general, why we sing different things during this season than we do at any other season of the year. So, thank you very much.